Welcome. My name's Clyde. I travel through time, but not for the reasons you'd expect. Not for battles. Not for treasures. Not even for secrets. Mostly, I just look around. And sometimes, like today, I find myself in the middle of a warm, still afternoon, watching paint dry in ancient Rome. That's it. No chase scenes, no surprises. Just the hum of bees, the rhythm of a brush on stone, and the way the light settles on old walls like it's got nowhere better to be. So if you're ready to get wonderfully bored, I'll take you with me. Just close your eyes, and we'll drift through time together. I didn't plan to spend the day watching paint dry in ancient Rome, but that's how it unfolded. The villa was quiet when I arrived. The kind of quiet you can only find just past noon, when the sun has flattened everything into long shadows and softened the air until it feels like you're breathing through warm silk. I could hear a fountain somewhere nearby, a lazy trickle, not particularly urgent, and the low clink of something ceramic far off, maybe a dish being set on stone. There was a painter working on one of the outer walls of the courtyard. Not frescoes, nothing elaborate, just a fresh coat of a pale red, almost like pomegranate juice left in the sun. He dipped his brush slowly, methodically, dragging it across the surface in slow, horizontal lines. I could have walked past, but something about the rhythm held me there. So I stayed. The paint was thick, slow to soak into the plaster. It left behind tiny ridges with each stroke, which caught the sunlight in a way that reminded me of sandstone cliffs I once saw in Utah, though that was several thousand years later. Or earlier. I forget. There were bees. Not many. Just enough to hum quietly in the nearby fig trees, which were fat with overripe fruit and didn't seem to mind my presence. I sat down on a carved bench that looked like it had been there forever, the edges smoothed by weather and time, and let my eyes follow the brush. Back and forth, back and forth. The painter didn't acknowledge me at first, which was fine. I wasn't particularly eager to talk. I just wanted to exist there for a while, like a dropped coin that had rolled into a corner and decided to stay. Every so often, he'd pause and lean back to admire his work. Sometimes he'd nod. Sometimes he'd frown a little, then go over the same spot again with a little more pressure, the bristles whispering against the wall like a broom against linen. It was soothing. The wall he was painting seemed endless, though that may have been a trick of the heat. Everything felt slower here, like the sun had thickened time itself. Even my thoughts moved gently, like lazy fish drifting in a warm current. At one point, I closed my eyes for a moment and imagined what it would be like to be a color drying on a wall. Not the painter, not even the paint, just the idea of color, resting in sunlight, absorbing heat, becoming something permanent or close enough. When I opened my eyes again, a small lizard had made its way onto the edge of the bench beside me. It froze when I turned my head, its little belly pulsing with breath. I didn't move. Neither did it. We stared at each other, sharing a moment of perfect nonchalance. The painter finally looked over and gave a small nod. I returned it. No words. Just mutual acknowledgement of a hot afternoon and a shared appreciation for the unhurried process of things. Somewhere deeper in the villa, a wind chime stirred. It sounded like delicate bones tapping together, or maybe seashells. Either way, it suited the stillness. The painter stepped back again and squinted at a corner near the base of the wall. He bent slowly, not from age, I think, just from caution, and dabbed at a small irregularity. His brush barely touched the plaster, just enough to smooth out whatever had caught his eye. Then he straightened, sighed softly, and returned to his spot. I could tell he was someone who took pride in his work. Not loudly, not with any urgency, just a quiet satisfaction, the way you might feel when folding a well-washed sheet or lining up bottles on a shelf. Eventually, he did speak. His voice was low, scratchy, like a broom that had been used for years. "The wall was white before," he said. "Too bright, the sun bounced off it. Hurt the eyes." I nodded. "This color's better. More honest," he said, dipping his brush again. That was the end of the conversation for a while. He kept painting. I kept sitting. Time drifted by like dandelion fluff. There, but barely. At some point, a servant passed by with a tray of olives and bread. I must have looked like I belonged because he set it down beside me without question. The bread was dense and uneven. The olives were still dusty from the tree. Both were perfect. I ate slowly, the way you do when there's no need to hurry. A small breeze came through the courtyard and shifted the curtain of a nearby doorway. I caught a glimpse of something inside, a bowl of lemons maybe, or wax fruit. I didn't get up to check. The paint was starting to darken. The top part of the wall had dried faster, baked by the full weight of the sun. The bottom still glistened faintly, catching the light in a way that reminded me of wet clay. The painter stepped back and wiped his forehead with the back of his arm. He was older than I'd thought. His hair was gray at the temples, and his tunic had a small tear near the shoulder that he hadn't bothered to mend. "Almost done," he said, though he didn't sound eager. More like someone finishing a puzzle for the third time. I watched him work the last section near the edge of the archway, careful not to smear what had already dried. He was using a smaller brush now, with a finer tip. The strokes were shorter, more precise, like he was putting the final touches on something that didn't need them, but felt better for having them. A bee landed on the tray beside me, nosed around a bit, and flew off again. The painter sat down on a low stool and ran his fingers through a bowl of clean sand. He sprinkled a bit along the base of the wall where the paint was still wet, just a dusting to prevent the wind from kicking up grit and ruining the finish. Or maybe he just liked the way it looked. I didn't ask. I leaned back against the bench, closed my eyes again, and listened. There was a kind of harmony to the villa, like the stones themselves were holding their breath. A nearby bird gave a single chirp, then fell quiet, as if it too had decided this wasn't the time for conversation. I could feel the curve of the stone under my shoulder blades, warm from the sun, but not too hot. Just warm. A held warmth. Ancient warmth. "I mix my own pigments," the painter said after a while. I opened one eye. "Really?" He nodded, still sifting sand through his fingers like he was counting the grains. "This one's made from crushed madder root. Took me nearly a month to get it right. You boil it, dry it, grind it, boil it again, then strain it through linen. Sometimes it turns too brown, sometimes too pink. Seems like a lot of work." He shrugged. "Not if you enjoy it." And he did. I could tell. Not just from the way he talked, but from the way he moved. Each gesture deliberate, unrushed. Like someone who understood the value of time because he didn't need to chase it. I thought about telling him what I was, where, or rather when, I was from. But I didn't. Not because he wouldn't believe me. Just because it didn't seem necessary. Some people carry the kind of silence that makes explanations feel rude, like interrupting a cat stretching in the sun. He stood up again and walked to a large clay pot in the corner of the courtyard. Inside was a mixture of something thick and dark. More pigment, I assumed. He stirred it slowly with a flat stick, pausing now and then to glance up at the sky. The clouds had started to stretch thin, like pulled cotton, leaving long white threads across the blue. "Sometimes," he said, not looking at me, "I think the world was made just for color." He dipped the stick into the pot again, lifted it, and let a single drop fall onto the stone floor. It left a soft mark, like blood from a fruit. Everything else, people, houses, history, it's just the backdrop, The canvas, but the colors are what we're really here for. I didn't disagree. My eye caught on a patch of ivy crawling slowly along the wall just to the left of his paintwork. The leaves were glossy, deep green, and stubborn, clinging to the stone as if they had nowhere else to go. I watched an ant make its way across one leaf, stop, change its mind, and turn back the way it came. It felt like a metaphor, though for what I wasn't sure. The painter started humming a tune I didn't recognize. It didn't have a melody so much as a rhythm, more like the sound of waves lapping against a boat or the creak of a wooden gate swaying in the wind. He set the stick down and looked over at me again. "You're not from around here?" It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "I'm not." He nodded once, satisfied. "Thought so." Then he went back to his wall. The sun shifted slightly, just enough that a beam of light moved from one column to another, tracing a golden line across the floor. Dust floated through it lazily, turning slowly in the air like dancers with nowhere to be. I stood up, stretched my arms, and walked slowly toward the fountain I'd heard earlier. It wasn't far, just past a short row of potted herbs and a basket of discarded lemon peels. The fountain was older than the villa, I guessed. The stone was worn smooth from centuries of water, and the central figure, a cherub maybe, or a very chubby man, had lost most of its face to time. The water spilled gently from a broken urn it held in its arms, splashing into a moss-lined basin below. The sound was soft, rhythmic, not too loud, like a whisper trying not to wake anyone. I dipped my fingers in. It was colder than I expected, startling in the gentlest way. A few bees hovered nearby but didn't come close. I think they sensed I wasn't part of their usual afternoon. I wasn't threatening, but I wasn't quite familiar either. I sat on the fountain's edge and let my mind drift. Not to any particular thought, just the idea of thinking. It was the kind of moment that makes you aware of your own breathing, the weight of your arms, the way your feet rest on the earth. Being in the past often felt like that, like my senses turned up just a little, tuning into things I usually missed. A soft breeze came through again, bringing the scent of sun-warmed stone and rosemary. Someone, somewhere, was baking something. I could smell flour and oil, maybe a hint of garlic. It made my stomach grumble, but I wasn't in any rush. The painter came around the corner, wiping his hands on a scrap of linen. "All done," he said. "Mostly." He sat beside me without invitation, and we both looked at the fountain for a while. I offered him the last olive from the tray, which he took with a small nod. "People always want to rush everything," he said, popping the olive into his mouth. "They think life's something you can win. It's not." He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. "It's something you sit with. Like wet paint. You let it settle. Let it breathe. Then eventually it's just part of the wall." I smiled. "That's a good way to put it. I've had time to think." We sat in silence again, long enough for the shadow of the cherub to shift slightly across the basin. The water caught the light just right, sending ripples of gold against the stone. He stood up after a while, dusted off his tunic, and gave me a look. "Come back tomorrow if you like. I've got shutters to do next." I nodded. "Maybe I will." He walked away without another word, disappearing behind a vine-covered archway. I stayed by the fountain a little longer, let the world settle, let my mind soften. And then, without really deciding to, I laid down on the warm stone beside the basin, tucked one arm under my head, and closed my eyes. Just for a moment. Maybe longer. I didn't expect to fall asleep. I really didn't. But the sound of the fountain, the warmth of the stone, and the way the light shimmered against my eyelids, it all sort of blurred together into something like a lullaby. And then I was dreaming. Or maybe I wasn't. With time travel, you never really know. Sometimes dreams feel like memories. Sometimes memories feel like borrowed stories. In the dream, if that's what it was, I was still lying beside the fountain, but the cherub had moved. It wasn't holding the urn anymore. It was balancing a lemon on its knee and trying to whistle through a cracked seashell. The sound was off-key and wet, but it didn't seem to mind. There were cats, at least 4 of them. One was sleeping on my chest. Another batted lazily at the hem of my tunic. The third was staring intently at the lemon. The fourth I never saw. I just sensed it nearby, watching from the shadows. The paint on the wall, remember the wall, had started to peel. Not badly, just curling slightly at the corners, like old parchment. The color had deepened in the sun, turning from soft red to something more rust-like, more grounded. The painter stood beside it, humming again, holding his brush like a tuning fork. He dipped it into the air this time, as if the pigment were floating in invisible pools, and began to paint shapes that weren't quite there. A doorway, a wheel, a bird in flight that never landed. I opened my mouth to ask what he was doing, but no sound came out. Just a faint breath, like dust being stirred. Instead, I watched. Behind him, the courtyard stretched, longer than before, much longer, as if time itself had stretched too. The fig trees were taller, the bees slower. The sky had softened into a kind of endless lavender, like dusk that didn't know how to end. Someone walked past with a basket of wet laundry. The clothes weren't Roman anymore. They looked like they belonged to a countryside in France, or maybe Wales. The woman didn't see me, or maybe she did and didn't care. She disappeared through a narrow door that hadn't been there before. The cats shifted. One climbed into the fountain. It didn't get wet. The cherub whistled again, now holding a sprig of rosemary like a wand. "I think I'm dreaming," I whispered, or thought, or believed. The painter nodded without turning. Maybe. Maybe not. His brush never stopped. "Does it matter?" he asked. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to ask where I was, what time it was, whether I'd fallen forward or backward in the stream of things, but all I could think about was how nice the lemon smelled. Someone began to sing nearby. Not loudly, just a thread of music winding through the arches, weaving itself into the stones. It was in no language I recognized, or maybe it was in all of them. The ivy on the wall grew while I watched, creeping slowly but purposefully, curling around the painted doorway. The color from the wall bled into the leaves, making them shimmer with dusty rose. The fountain began to bubble a little more cheerfully, and then I was walking. Not far, just along the edge of the courtyard. My footsteps made no sound. The stones beneath me were warm and faintly glowing, like embers that had decided to become floor tiles instead. I passed the fig trees again. One dropped a fruit at my feet. I picked it up, turned it over in my palm, and for a moment I was sure it had a tiny face. Not smiling, not frowning, just existing, content to be looked at and then forgotten. I didn't eat it. The painter was gone now. The cats were lined up where he'd been standing, tails flicking in unison, watching the paint dry as though it were a play. The wall was finished, and then a bell rang. Not a loud bell, a soft one, just one note, held for a long time, and when it faded, I opened my eyes. The sky had shifted again. The blue was deeper now, brushed with gold near the horizon. The sun was starting to tip away, just barely. Not quite evening, but getting there. The water in the fountain sparkled differently, a little cooler in tone. The basin now had a single olive leaf floating in it, spinning slowly, tracing a lazy circle. I sat up. The stone had left marks on my arm, tiny indentations like miniature bricks. I rubbed them gently. There was no sign of the painter, no sign of the cats. Even the bees had quieted. The tray with the bread and olives was gone. Someone had cleared it without waking me. The wall, though, that was still there. Dry now. The color had settled perfectly. Not too bright, not too dull. Just enough. It looked like it had always been that way. I stood and stretched, feeling the gentle pull of my spine. My knees popped, but politely. I walked back across the courtyard, past the ivy, past the worn bench, and paused once more in front of the wall. I reached out and ran my fingers lightly across it. The paint was smooth, with just enough texture to catch the tips of my fingers, still faintly warm. I thought about writing my initials in the corner, leaving a mark, a tiny secret from a time traveler to the past. But I didn't. Instead, I whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular. Then I turned, slowly, and walked back through the archway. The air smelled like stone and rosemary and sun. I had nowhere to be, and all the time in the world to get there. The archway led to a narrow corridor shaded by vines and wooden beams. The stones beneath my feet were older here, worn uneven in places, smoothed in others, and patched now and then with mismatched tiles. I stepped slowly, listening to the soft creak of the pergola above me, where dry leaves rustled with the wind. At the end of the path was a garden I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't large, more like a tucked-away square of green surrounded by sun-baked walls and sleepy pottery. There was a small olive tree in the center, its trunk twisted like a braid, and patches of herbs growing in the corners. Lavender, thyme, maybe a little mint. I couldn't be sure. The smells were soft and sun-steeped, like memories of a meal long past. I wandered in and sat on a flat stone near the tree. The sun filtered through the leaves above me, dotting my arms and legs with little patches of gold. The air here was still, not silent, just settled. It felt like a room that had been waiting a very long time for someone to sit in it. There was a low wall along the far side of the garden. Beyond it, I could just make out the rooftops of other villas, each one stretching toward the sky at slightly different angles, like a congregation of old men trying to hear something. Their clay tiles glowed faintly in the descending sun, and I thought I could see a small trail of smoke from someone's oven curling into the sky. I leaned back and closed my eyes again, not to sleep, just to listen. There was a bird somewhere nearby, not singing, just hopping through the leaves, rustling them with little feet. I heard the soft thud of something dropping, a fig maybe, or a pine cone. No reaction followed. The garden remained at ease. I opened my eyes and looked up at the olive tree. Its leaves shimmered faintly in the breeze, each one catching a bit of the light, turning it gently in its palm before letting it go. I thought about how many seasons it must have seen, how many slow mornings, how many afternoons like this one. And I started to wonder, had I been here before? Not today, obviously. Not even this month, but maybe in another time. A different trip, a different version of the villa. Maybe the tree had been younger. Maybe I'd been younger too. Time doesn't always travel in straight lines. At least, not for me. Sometimes it circles back on itself, like a cat curling into a nap. Sometimes I arrive at a moment and feel something catch. Something soft and familiar, like the edge of a song I can't quite name. I ran a hand along the surface of the stone beside me. It had little grooves etched into it, patterns maybe, or wear from decades of use. I traced them slowly, wondering who else had done the same. Maybe someone from the future. Maybe someone from long before me. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of baked earth and olive brine. My stomach gave another soft reminder that I hadn't eaten much, but I didn't move. Hunger didn't feel urgent here. It felt like something you acknowledged and let drift. A soft tapping sound caught my attention. I looked over and saw a tortoise making its way along the edge of the garden, moving with the kind of purposeful slowness that I always admire. It didn't seem to notice me. Or perhaps it did and simply didn't care. I watched it for a long time, long enough to forget what time it was. I briefly considered following it, just standing up and moving at its pace, one slow footstep at a time, but instead I stayed where I was, letting the quiet of the garden pour in around me like warm water in a shallow bowl. There was a bench under the olive tree. I hadn't noticed it at first. It was half covered in dried leaves and had a cracked cushion that looked like it hadn't been sat on in a while. I rose and dusted it off gently, then sat down. The cushion released a faint puff of lavender when I settled in. Not perfume, just the memory of it, held in the threads. I leaned back and let my head rest against the wood. From here, I could see the edge of the courtyard through the vines. The painted wall was just visible, its color richer now in the late day light. The painter was gone, the cats too, but the wall remained. Solid, dry, quiet. I imagined what it would be like to stay here for a while. Just remain. No ticking clocks, no swirling portal light. Just this garden, this bench, the slow parade of hours passing unnoticed. I let my mind drift again. Once, I spent 6 days in a monastery outside Kyoto, trying to learn the art of silence. I failed mostly. I kept wanting to ask the monks questions about the floorboards and the way the light fell through their paper windows. But one of them, very old, very quiet, told me that the best kind of silence is the kind that fills itself up from the edges. This garden felt like that. Not empty, full, in a way that didn't need explaining. I reached into my satchel and pulled out a small notebook. I carry it with me, though I rarely write anything useful. Most of the pages are filled with descriptions of soup or the names of birds I think I saw but never checked. I opened it to a blank page and wrote, "Olive tree, warm bench, one tortoise, the wall is done." Then I closed the notebook and tucked it away again. The sun dipped lower. The sky was streaked now with orange and pink, like someone had run a brush across it without cleaning the bristles first. The garden caught that light and held it gently, glowing from the inside out. I exhaled slowly. It felt like I'd been holding that breath for hours, or centuries. The wind picked up just slightly, not enough to stir alarm, just enough to ruffle the leaves and remind everything it still existed. I stood up from the bench slowly, as if not to disturb the peace it had gathered over the years. I brushed a few bits of dried lavender from the folds of my tunic and stretched my arms overhead. My spine made a soft cracking sound, like parchment being gently unfolded. The tortoise was gone. Or maybe it had never really been there. Or maybe it had simply done what I hadn't. Moved on. I wandered back the way I'd come, letting my fingers trail against the vines along the corridor wall. They were coarse and fragrant. Some of them clung to my sleeve, not in protest, just in passing. Back in the courtyard, the wall stood just as I'd left it. Still dry. Still complete. The color had mellowed even further, deepened into something I couldn't name. Not red, not brown, not rose. Something in between. Like the color of memory, or the space behind closed eyes. There were no sounds of work now. No brushes, no bees. Just the occasional coo of a bird and the fading splash of the fountain, now quieter than before. I paused in the center of the courtyard, turning slowly to take in the symmetry of it all. The way the columns framed the space, the way the sun lit only half of the fig tree, as if shading in a page, line by line. I walked once around the perimeter, not in a rush. I stepped lightly, not out of caution, but out of respect. Some places ask you to whisper without ever saying so. This was one of them. As I passed near the columned edge of the villa, I noticed a small table I hadn't seen earlier. It had a single chair beside it, and a folded cloth lay neatly on top. There was also a cup. Empty now, but I could still see the faint trace of something herbal dried along the rim. Sage, perhaps. Or marjoram. I sat down in the chair and let my hands rest on the table. The wood was old, but steady, scratched in places, burnished smooth in others. A few rings had been worn into the surface, small circles left by cups long since cleared away, evidence of other quiet afternoons, maybe even centuries ago. I traced one of the rings with my fingertip. Something about the way the light hit the courtyard made it feel like the day was folding in on itself. Not ending exactly, just curling inward, like a leaf closing as dusk approaches. I tilted my head and listened closely. There was a faint sound, not music, not speech, just a hum, a low vibration in the air like the gentle breath of something enormous sleeping nearby. I've felt that before. When time begins to shift, when a pocket of the past begins to soften, readying itself to blur into the next moment, it hums, not with sound exactly, but with feeling, with stillness made audible. I leaned back in the chair and watched the painted wall once more. It seemed farther away now, as if the courtyard had stretched or the air between us had thickened. I blinked, and for just a moment, the wall looked unfinished again. The color faded. The painter returned. But when I blinked again, it was gone. Dry, solid, whole. The table beside me had a small drawer. I opened it, not out of curiosity, but out of habit. Inside was a folded slip of parchment. I unfolded it carefully, expecting it to be blank. It almost was. In the center, written in a hand I didn't recognize, were 3 words. You stayed still. That was it. I smiled. It didn't feel like a warning or a clue, just an observation, a nod from the villa or the wall, or maybe from time itself. A note left for me by the moment. I refolded the parchment and placed it back inside. I stayed at the table a little longer, watching as the light shifted further. Shadows climbed slowly up the columns, like tired travelers ascending stairs. The sun no longer reached the painted wall. It rested now in the high leaves, tracing their edges with dull fire. I stood and stretched again, this time with a soft sigh. It was nearly time to go. I wandered toward the far edge of the villa, where the stone steps led down into a shaded grove. I knew what I would find there, not in detail, but in essence. The place where I'd arrived, the place where I would leave. It's never the same doorway. Sometimes it's an arch, sometimes a tree, sometimes the shadow between 2 boulders just wide enough for breath. Today, it was a half-broken gate, swallowed by ivy, left open just a sliver. I stood before it and turned to look back one more time. The villa was quiet again. No painter, no olives, no tortoise. But the color remained, and the wall, it looked like it had been there forever. The gate was more vine than wood now, its hinges long forgotten, its edges softened by centuries of patient ivy. I brushed a strand aside and stepped through, careful not to tug too hard. It felt wrong to disturb it more than necessary. The grove beyond was quiet, shaded in dusky blues and soft grays. The trees here were older still, their trunks wide and gnarled, roots pressing up through the soil like sleeping limbs. The ground beneath my feet shifted gently, soft with fallen leaves and the hush of endings. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of the fountain lingered. Fainter now, as though remembering itself rather than continuing. I paused near one of the trees and leaned against its trunk. There's a feeling that sometimes comes to me at the edges of these journeys. Not homesickness exactly, more like time sickness. A soft ache, like I've stayed just long enough to become part of the moment. Long enough to matter, but not long enough to remain. I closed my eyes, and for a heartbeat, I felt the villa behind me breathe. Not literally, of course, but the stones seemed to exhale. The air shifted. The silence rippled. And when I opened my eyes again, the grove looked different. Not changed, just distant, like a memory already fading even as it formed. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out the device I keep with me. It has no buttons, no lights, no noise. It just is. A polished stone the size of my palm, threaded with faint markings that move sometimes, but only when I'm not looking. I held it gently in both hands and thought, not of a destination, but of stillness. That's the trick, really. Time doesn't respond to direction. It responds to presence, to attention, to the weight of your breath and the space between thoughts. The stone warmed in my hand, softly. The air folded, and the world around me turned inside out, not with a bang, but with a sigh. When I opened my eyes again, I was somewhere else. When else, but I'll tell you about that another time. For now, just remember the warmth of sunlit stone, the rhythm of a brush, the hum of bees in the distance, the quiet satisfaction of a wall turning from wet to dry, and the way the world softens when you decide to sit still for a while. There's no hurry, not here, not anymore. Sleep well, traveler. I'll see you in another time.